It was the winter of 1943. Berlin's nights were blackened by smoke and sirens, and high above, the rumble of engines signaled the relentless return of the Royal Air Force. Amidst the chaos of the air war, a single aircraft, Lancaster ED-825 of No. 617 Squadron, would vanish without a trace, leaving behind one of the most puzzling mysteries of Bomber Command. Operation Hydra had begun as part of the RAF's ongoing campaign to cripple Germany's war machine. The night of December 16, 1943, was brutally cold over Lincolnshire. Frost glistened across the runways of RAF Scampton, home of the now legendary Dambusters. Since their daring Ruhr Valley raid earlier that year, 617 Squadron had been assigned to increasingly secretive missions. But this one was different. Few men on the base knew the full objective. The target, simply coded as Objective Berlin, North Sector, had been issued with an unusual secondary instruction: radio silence after waypoint echo. At 22:15 hours, under the dim red glow of the hangar lights, ground crews worked swiftly, fitting special pods beneath the bomb bays, devices not listed on the official manifest. The airmen joked about them being radar jammers, though no one seemed to know for sure. Flight Lieutenant Henry Collins, the 27-year-old pilot of ED-825, scribbled a final note in his flight log before takeoff. Orders changed last minute. New course coordinates sealed. We'll find out in the air. As the four Rolls-Royce Merlin engines roared to life, the massive bomber lumbered down the icy runway and climbed into the darkness. Behind them, the base disappeared into a sea of cloud. Inside the cockpit, Collins and his crew followed their route over the North Sea, maintaining strict radio silence. The intercom crackled occasionally, routine checks, navigation updates, and the rhythmic hum of men who had done this far too many times. But just before reaching the German coastline, at 23:48 hours, the ground controllers at RAF Digby noted something odd. ED-825's transponder blip flickered, then reappeared, 30 miles off its expected course. The crew didn't report any mechanical issue or enemy contact. Instead, a coded message came through, short and cryptic, switching to black. After that, nothing. The rest of the bomber stream pressed on toward Berlin, facing the inferno of anti-aircraft fire and the piercing searchlights that clawed at the night sky. Of the 457 aircraft that participated in the raid, 47 would never return. But when morning came, the loss of ED-825 stood out, not for its absence, but for its enigma. The RAF's post-sortie report listed the aircraft as missing, presumed lost over Germany. Yet no distress call, wreckage, or parachute sightings were ever confirmed. One mechanic later recalled, "It was as if she'd flown into the clouds and never come out again." For weeks, 617 Squadron's records remained incomplete, the final flight path redacted, even from internal briefings. Commander Guy Gibson, who had led the Dambusters earlier that year, made a terse remark in his diary. "Collins' crew were on something not meant for the rest of us, told to ask no more." For those back home, the pain was silent but deep. Families received the dreaded telegrams with little explanation. "Missing in action" was the phrase typed neatly in black ink, the same words that echoed across thousands of British households. Yet for the wives and parents of ED-825's crew, something felt unfinished. There had been no wreckage, no burial, not even confirmation from German authorities. Just silence. Historians later suggested that the flight may have been part of early radar deception trials, precursors to what would become Operation Window, where strips of aluminum foil, known as chaff, confused enemy radar. But ED-825's mission profile didn't match any known testing schedule. One declassified memo from RAF High Command, dated December 20th, contained a chilling line: "Do not pursue inquiries concerning the loss of aircraft ED-825. Material classified beyond Bomber Command authority." It's a phrase that still raises questions today. Why would a missing bomber, one among hundreds, be locked under higher classification than even the Dambuster raids? What exactly had the crew been ordered to carry or test that night over Berlin? As historians would later piece together fragments of the story, one detail would stand out: the sealed course change Collins mentioned in his logbook. The coordinates, when compared to standard bombing routes, didn't point toward Berlin at all, but toward a region near Poland, hundreds of miles off the intended target. Whatever had caused that deviation remains one of the enduring mysteries of World War II aviation. Some believe the aircraft suffered navigational malfunction. Others suspect it was diverted for a clandestine mission under the cover of the Berlin raid. In the cold light of dawn, as the surviving bombers limped home to Lincolnshire, the absence of ED-825 was quietly noted and filed away. The airmen would toast their lost comrades that night in the mess hall, as they always did. Yet none could shake the feeling that this disappearance was different. As one veteran later recalled in an interview, "We lost a lot of good men, but Colin's lot, they just vanished. No flames, no wreck, no word. Just gone." The war would rage on, Berlin would burn again, and history would roll forward. But somewhere between the black skies of Germany and the icy plains of Eastern Europe, one RAF Lancaster and its 7 crew slipped beyond the known record, taking their secret with them. And decades later, a rediscovered flight log, a single note scrawled in pencil, course change sealed, would reopen a mystery that had been buried since that cold December night. In the weeks following the Berlin raid, the airfields of Lincolnshire were blanketed in fog and secrecy. The men of No. 617 Squadron carried on their duties, but something was different. The loss of Lancaster, ED-825, wasn't treated like the others. There were no memorial briefings, no debrief forms, and no official mention during roll call. It was as if the crew had simply been erased from the squadron's history. RAF Scampton, December 1943. The hangars echoed with the sounds of repair crews working through the night, the metallic clang of wrenches blending with the low drone of generators. Beneath this routine hum, rumors spread quietly. Collins was on a radar job, some said. Experimental countermeasures. Others whispered that ED-825 had been diverted by someone outside Bomber Command. But no one could confirm it. And anyone who asked questions was told the same thing. You don't have clearance. The squadron's new commanding officer, Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, received a terse order from Group Headquarters. Do not pursue missing crew of ED-825. Classified under Section X. Even for Cheshire, a decorated pilot who'd flown over 100 sorties, that wording was unsettling. Section X wasn't standard RAF terminology. It was intelligence language, reserved for operations involving the Air Ministry's most secret divisions. Back in Lincolnshire, the families waited for answers that never came. Margaret Collins, Henry's wife, wrote letter after letter to the Air Ministry. The replies were polite but hollow. No further information available at this time. She later confided to a neighbor that one letter arrived unmarked, containing only a single line typed on plain paper. Your husband served his country in a capacity that cannot yet be disclosed. The envelope bore no return address. Meanwhile, radio operators at RAF Digby reviewed the night's transmissions. Among hundreds of logs, one stood out. Collins' last message, switching to black. It didn't match any known radio procedure. Analysts tried to decode it, thinking it might be an emergency code or reference to radar status. None of the existing ciphers matched. The message was filed away under unverified communication, and soon forgotten amid the chaos of ongoing missions. In early January 1944, a secret meeting was held at RAF High Wycombe, headquarters of Bomber Command. Intelligence officers reviewed a classified addendum regarding Project Blacklight, a radar deception initiative under development by the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE. The aim? To project false bomber signals, confusing German night fighter defenses. The project was so sensitive that even Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, had limited access to the full details. According to later testimony from RAF engineer Harold Lewis, we were testing the edge of what radar could perceive. It was like painting in the dark. Sometimes the paint disappeared. But among the reports, one entry stood out. Field test of prototype transmission array aboard modified Lancaster unit. December 16, 1943. Status: unresolved. The date and aircraft description matched ED-825. Squadron engineers recalled that Collins' aircraft had been fitted with unfamiliar antenna modifications beneath the fuselage. They had been told it was a dummy mount. No one questioned it. In wartime Britain, curiosity could look dangerously like disloyalty. Even among the ground crew, whispers persisted. One mechanic, Albert Renshaw, later wrote in his diary, "After Collins went missing, 2 men from London arrived. Not RAF, no insignia, no rank. They removed all logs, photographs, even our maintenance sheets. Said it was for post-mission evaluation. We never saw them again." The men of 617 Squadron pushed forward with new missions, but an uneasy silence lingered in the mess hall. Flight crews avoided talking about the one that didn't come back. When a reporter from the Lincolnshire Echo requested to cover the story of the missing bomber, his inquiry was blocked by the Air Ministry's press division. The official line, "No aircraft of that description is recorded as missing on that date." Behind closed doors, however, the RAF's intelligence branch was still watching. A short memo dated February 1944 read, "Signal intercepts from occupied Europe indicate a possible sighting of RAF Lancaster flying at low altitude, heading east, 2350 hours on the 16th. The coordinates place the sighting near the Dutch coast, far from the designated Berlin route." The report ended with a single handwritten note, "No verification possible. Maintain silence." From a strategic perspective, the disappearance wasn't just tragic, it was potentially catastrophic. If the Germans had captured the new radar equipment, it could compromise months of research. But no such capture was ever reported by the Luftwaffe. No wreckage was found. It was as though ED-825 had simply vanished from both Allied and Axis records. Years later, historian Paul Brickhill would write his 1951 book The Dam Busters. Even among the men of 617 Squadron, there were stories you didn't ask about. Collins' flight was one of them. That line was removed from later editions, likely under government pressure. For those who serve alongside him, the memory of Flight Lieutenant Collins was a shadowed one. Brave, professional, and calm, even under fire. But now, his name was being quietly erased from operational rosters, his crew's record sealed. The human cost of secrecy had begun to weigh heavily on those who knew the truth, or at least fragments of it. As one aging radar officer later said in a BBC interview decades after the war, "We thought we were fighting with light, radar, technology, science. But sometimes, it felt like the war itself fought back with darkness." And so, the mystery deepened. The crew of ED-825 remained officially missing, but whispers of blacklight and Section X began circulating among the intelligence corridors of London. Someone, somewhere, knew what had really happened, but they weren't talking. The next clue wouldn't come from Britain at all, but from occupied Europe, where weeks after the raid, German night fighter crews reported something extraordinary over the frozen skies of Holland. January 1944. Over the frigid night skies of occupied Holland, the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 1, NJG-1, scrambled into action. Their mission was routine: intercept incoming RAF bombers returning from the Berlin raid. But that night, radar operators at Leeuwarden detected something unusual. A single aircraft, large and slow-moving, breaking formation and descending to less than 2,000 feet. It carried no identification, no beacon, and emitted a strange, fluctuating signal. Oberleutnant Friedrich Fritz Reimer, a night fighter pilot flying the twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110G4, was among those vectored toward the contact. Reimer recalled, decades later, "Our radar picked it up for a moment, then nothing. It vanished, like it had dropped off the earth. We thought the radar had failed, but the ground controllers confirmed the contact was still flying, though its echo appeared to split into multiple returns. Something about its radar profile didn't make sense." Minutes later, near the Zuider See, the vast inland sea now known as IJsselmeer, Reimer's gunner spotted a black silhouette moving low against the water. It was a 4-engine bomber, unmistakably British, yet it flew with lights extinguished and without defensive fire. Reimer's crew closed in, expecting to see the familiar markings of a Lancaster. Instead, the fuselage seemed stripped of paint, almost reflective in the moonlight, with no identifying code letters visible. Reimer gave chase, but as he described his 1959 memoir Himmeljager, the bomber climbed slightly, banking toward the east. I moved to intercept when our radar operator shouted, "Signal gone." The screen was blank. I looked up again, and the bomber was simply gone. No fire, no debris, no explosion. Just gone. His squadron filed a standard combat report noting unconfirmed visual contact with unidentified RAF bomber employing unknown countermeasure. The entry was stamped Geheim, classified. In occupied territory below, Dutch resistance members were also watching the sky that night. A farmer near Kampen told British intelligence after the war that he saw a British bomber flying low and silent, pursued by fighters. Then the fighters broke away. The bomber turned inland and disappeared toward the east. His testimony was logged by MI9, the section responsible for escape and evasion, but dismissed as unreliable. Yet, when cross-referenced years later, his report matched the time and direction of Reimer's encounter almost exactly. So what was ED-825 doing there? Far from its assigned route, heading east instead of west back to Britain. Some post-war analysts believe the bomber had been testing an active jamming system capable of confusing enemy radar, essentially making the aircraft appear to vanish. Others suspected a navigational failure, perhaps caused by experimental equipment interfering with its own compass systems. But that didn't explain the silence, or why no distress calls were ever made. RAF intelligence files, declassified in 1998, mention a ghost return detected briefly by British radar stations along the Norfolk coast around 2:10 hours, roughly the time ED-825 would have been expected to return. The contact appeared 60 miles offshore, then vanished after less than a minute. No aircraft confirmed an area, the report read. Possible atmospheric anomaly, but the timing, direction, and altitude all matched the missing Lancaster. In a 1944 interrogation report recovered after the war, a captured Luftwaffe radar officer described the incident in technical terms. The British bomber appeared on our screen in 3 distinct positions, as if it were splitting and recombining. We believed at the time it was using a new kind of interference beam. He noted that after that night, German radar crews were ordered to recalibrate their equipment as phantom echoes were becoming more frequent. Historians today know this technology as window, chaff made from strips of aluminum foil that confused radar. But blacklight, the operation linked to ED-825, was rumored to be something beyond passive deception, an active emitter designed to alter radar signatures in real time. If successful, it could render an aircraft practically invisible to detection. Yet, no working prototype was ever recovered. Decades later, Dutch aviation researchers combed through the archives of both the RAF and the Luftwaffe, looking for corroborating evidence. In 1978, a retired German technician named Hans Becker contacted the Imperial War Museum, claiming he had once handled strange British wreckage shipped to a Luftwaffe test center in Rechlin in early 1944. Becker recalled metallic fragments with unfamiliar insulation patterns, not typical of any German or Allied aircraft we knew. When shown photographs of a Lancaster's internal structure, he hesitated, then said, "No, this was something else, something altered." His claim was never verified. To this day, no conclusive wreckage of ED-825 has ever been found in Holland or the surrounding seas. The RAF's Missing Research and Inquiry Service, MRES, conducted aerial surveys in 1947, recovering fragments from several downed bombers near the IJsselmeer, but none matched the serial numbers or structural configuration of Collins' aircraft. For the families of the crew, it was another dead end, another layer of mystery added to an already impossible puzzle. For the RAF, it was a potential embarrassment wrapped in secrecy, an advanced system tested in wartime conditions that either failed catastrophically or succeeded so well that even its own operators couldn't be found. One post-war analysis concluded with chilling understatement. If the system performed as designed, visual and radar observation would both have been compromised. The aircraft could, theoretically, vanish from detection entirely. What began as a mission to test new technology had become a story of total disappearance, not only from radar screens, but from history itself. And while the Allies moved forward with their bombing campaigns, deep within the intelligence division of the Air Ministry, a file was quietly marked for restricted circulation. ED-825, Unresolved Anomaly, east of Berlin Sector. Its contents would not be opened again until decades later, when a discovery in a remote Polish forest would reignite the mystery once more. Winter, 1947, deep in the forests of western Poland, a salvage team from the Polish People's Army stumbled upon something unexpected. Buried under a thin crust of snow and soil lay twisted fragments of aircraft metal, dull, warped, and blackened by fire. At first, they assumed it was a downed Soviet plane from the war. But the fragments bore faint English, stenciling, and rivet patterns unlike any known Soviet or German design. One marking stood out, ED-8, the rest obscured by corrosion. Word of the find reached the British Embassy in Warsaw within weeks. The Air Ministry dispatched a liaison officer under diplomatic cover, Wing Commander Peter Bletchley, a wartime intelligence veteran now working in post-war recovery. His brief was straightforward: confirm whether the wreckage was Allied and report back. But when Bletchley arrived, he found more than just twisted metal. The crash site lay in a remote pine forest near Gorzo Wielkopolski, a region that had once been part of Nazi Germany. Scattered among the trees were fragments of fuselage, charred cloth, and the faint outline of an impact crater, shallow, as if the aircraft had made a controlled landing or skidded rather than exploded. Bletchley noted something even stranger: no engines, no propellers, no serial plates. It was as if the aircraft had been stripped clean before it burned. His official report, later discovered in declassified archives, contained a curious entry: markings consistent with Avro Lancaster, though modifications suggest prototype or variant. No record of such configuration in bomber command logs. Nearby, his team uncovered a small brass plate engraved with partial text: electronic counter. The rest was unreadable. Bletchley's diary, written in careful script, tells a different story. The aircraft was one of ours, but not on any manifest. I've been instructed to classify the find and make no further reference. There are eyes on this that do not wear RAF wings. The eyes he referred to were likely British intelligence officers operating under the newly formed SDS, later known as MI6. They arrived the next day, quietly dismissing the Polish team and ordering all remains removed to a secure site. Officially, nothing was ever recovered from Gorzo that winter. But locals remember the trucks that came at night, heavy, covered, and guarded. Witnesses also spoke of strange behavior from the British delegation. One Polish forester, interviewed in the 1970s, recalled they marked trees around the wreck with red paint, took photographs, and burned what they could not carry. They told us it was dangerous. Radiation or chemicals, they said. Whether that was true or a cover story remains unknown. Back in London, Bletchley filed his findings through secure channels. His memo to the Air Ministry contained one haunting sentence: if this is ED-825, the manner of its discovery raises serious questions about its flight path and final orders. Within days, his report was sealed and reassigned under the Ministry of Supply, a department responsible for advanced weapons and electronics research. That same month, his name disappeared from the Public Air Force Registry. For decades, little more was heard about the Gorzo discovery. But among those few who had seen the report, speculation grew. Some believed ED-825 had been diverted intentionally, carrying a classified radar prototype meant to test deep penetration signal distortion, part of Britain's early electronic warfare program. Others argued it had been lured eastward by false navigation signals, possibly from German radar experiments still active in 1943. Whatever the case, no human remains were found at the site. Not a single bone fragment, no personal effects, no sign of parachutes or graves. It was as though the crew had vanished before or after the crash. One engineer on Bletchley's team described it best: the cockpit glass was shattered, but there was no blood. Seats were torn loose, empty. It looked abandoned. By the 1950s, as Cold War tensions grew, the story of the lost Lancaster faded beneath layers of classified bureaucracy. Files were moved from Bomber Command to intelligence archives, stamped restricted, no public access. The incident became little more than a footnote in obscure research papers about radar testing during World War II. But in private, Bletchley remained haunted. His surviving notebook, discovered by his grandson decades later, contains one final, cryptic line written in 1948. They wanted it forgotten, but I still hear the engines over the trees. Whether this was the reflection of a guilt-ridden veteran or the echo of something more literal remains open to interpretation. What is certain is that after his mission in Poland, Bletchley never worked for the Air Ministry again. He retired quietly, refusing all interviews until his death in 1973. And yet, his discovery marked a turning point. The existence of a classified British operation involving radar deception, one capable of causing an aircraft to disappear from detection, was no longer mere rumor. It had left its trace in the forests of Eastern Europe, burned and broken, but not erased. Still, the questions lingered. Why was the site never officially logged? Who ordered its destruction? And most of all, if the wreckage was truly ED-825, what had become of her crew? Those questions would find new life half a century later, when a wave of declassifications revealed a project name that appeared in the Air Ministry files only once: Operation Blacklight. London, 1998, when the National Archives began the long process of declassifying wartime documents under the 50-year rule, few expected anything remarkable to emerge from the dusty files of the Air Ministry. But among the stacks of routine correspondence and technical manuals, one folder caught the attention of a young historian named Daniel Mears. Its cover bore no title, only a reference code, AM/617/BLKLT. Inside were fragments of reports, lab memos, and a single typed page marked Top Secret, Operation Blacklight. The first line read, "Experimental Airborne Radar Deception Device Tested Under Live Conditions, December 1943. Platform, Lancaster ED-825. After more than half a century, the missing bomber finally had a name and a purpose. According to the recovered documents, Blacklight was the brainchild of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, Britain's cutting-edge radar laboratory. Building upon earlier successes with window, aluminum chaff that confused German radar, Blacklight sought to do something revolutionary: project false radar echoes while concealing the aircraft's real position. In theory, a bomber could appear in multiple places at once or vanish entirely from the enemy's scope. The December 1943 mission was to be a live test over hostile territory. ED-825 was chosen for its reliability and crew experience. Collins and his men were reportedly briefed not by Bomber Command, but by a group of civilian scientists escorted by plainclothes officers. Their orders were sealed until airborne. Operation Blacklight, the briefing note stated, is to be carried out in conjunction with the Berlin offensive, under full radio silence. Yet, there was a note scrawled in the margin by an unidentified officer. Prototype array, unstable under field conditions. Risk of signal feedback at full power. In modern terms, it meant the equipment could interfere with the aircraft's own instruments, possibly its compass, altimeter, or radio systems. That single line might explain everything. Further down in the file, another memo, dated January 1944, offered a chilling update. No signal returns after 2350 hours. Aircraft presumed lost. Recommend full suppression of program references pending further trials. Below that, a handwritten note in red pencil read, "Blacklight not to be mentioned in Bomber Command law summaries." As news of Mears' discovery spread through academic circles, RAF veterans began to come forward. One, Harold Lewis, a former TRE cryptographer, agreed to an interview for a BBC documentary in 1999. In it, he described his time working on radar countermeasures. "We were playing with shadows. The idea was to make the Germans chase what wasn't there. But sometimes the shadows turn on us." Collins' crew, they were part of something we weren't ready to control. When pressed on whether the equipment could have caused the Lancaster's disappearance, Lewis hesitated. Then he said quietly, "We didn't lose them to the enemy. We lost them to our own experiment." The documentary never aired in full. The BBC received a formal request from the Ministry of Defense to postpone broadcast, pending verification of classified material. The segment was shelved, and much of Mears' archival work was temporarily restricted. But by then, copies of the Blacklight file had already circulated among historians and aviation researchers, sparking a new wave of investigations. The technical appendix described how the Blacklight system worked, or was supposed to. It used synchronized pulses from an underbelly antenna array, powered by a modified H-2S radar unit. When activated, it emitted false radar returns at calculated intervals, effectively creating phantom aircraft around the real one. But the system required delicate tuning. A small misalignment could cause the signal to loop, overwhelming both the radar and the aircraft's internal electrical systems. If the array malfunctioned mid-flight, the effects could be disastrous. Interference with navigation instruments, radio blackout, or even electrical fire. It was plausible that ED-825 had suffered just such a failure, disoriented, forced off course, and ultimately lost over enemy territory. But this still didn't explain why the wreckage had been removed, or why all records had been buried so deeply. Some speculated that the mission had revealed something Britain wasn't ready to admit. Perhaps the accidental exposure of a technology so sensitive it bordered on espionage. Others, more cynically, believed the aircraft had been diverted deliberately for intelligence collection in the East, a mission disavowed when it went wrong. Whatever the truth, Operation Blacklight's legacy had been erased for half a century. And yet, fragments of it endured in whispered recollections among scientists who'd worked at TRE. One colleague of Lewis recalled him saying, "We thought we'd found a way to disappear from the enemy. Instead, we discovered how easy it is to disappear ourselves." For modern historians, the Blacklight documents revealed not only a technological milestone, but a cautionary tale. Wartime innovation often walked a thin line between brilliance and disaster, and sometimes the line vanished entirely. As one journalist summarized in The Guardian's 1999 feature on the case, perhaps the mystery of ED-825 isn't about where it went, but about what it represented, the cost of pushing the boundaries of invisibility before we truly understood the darkness we were entering. Still, one final mystery remained. If the wreckage in Poland truly belonged to ED-825, why did later radar surveys of the area show new metallic traces, small, scattered, and recent, as if the ground had been disturbed long after the war ended? The answer would emerge only in the 21st century, when a group of aviation archaeologists returned to that forest near Gorzo, armed with ground-penetrating radar, and uncovered something that suggested the story of ED-825 was far from over. Summer 2016, the forests near Gorzo-Wielkopolski were quiet again, reclaimed by decades of moss and silence. But on a warm August morning, a small group of British and Polish aviation archaeologists began a new survey of an area marked decades earlier as anomalous ground disturbance. Their leader, Dr. Claire Hathaway of Cambridge University, carried with her the declassified Air Ministry files, and the hope that, after 73 years, the story of Lancaster ED-825 could finally be resolved. The team's ground-penetrating radar picked up something metallic beneath the soil, not large enough to be a full aircraft, but dense and oddly structured. As they dug, layer by layer, they unearthed a cluster of warped aluminum panels, their surfaces scorched and brittle. Embedded within the wreckage was a small, circular component no one recognized at first. When cleaned, it revealed faint etching. TRE Experimental Array, 1943. It was the first physical confirmation that Operation Blacklight had been real. Nearby, they found something else, a section of cockpit framing with a partial serial number, ED-82. For Hathaway, the evidence was overwhelming. The fragments matched a Lancaster of the correct production block, and the experimental part confirmed it belonged to a radar test model. But there was still no trace of the crew, no human remains, no identification tags, nothing. It was as if the men of ED-825 had vanished before the aircraft came down. The discovery made headlines in both Poland and the UK. The Times called it Britain's lost ghost bomber, while the Telegraph wrote, "Lancaster mystery deepens as crash site yields secrets, not answers." In response, the Ministry of Defense issued a cautious statement. "We are aware of ongoing research related to wartime radar operations. There are no further records pertaining to aircraft ED-825. It was, essentially, the same line used in 1944. For the families of the crew, now in their third generation, the find was bittersweet. Henry Collins' granddaughter, Sarah, visited the site later that year. She placed a small RAF roundel in the soil and whispered, "At least now we know where you fell." But even she admitted, In a BBC interview, "We don't know how. We don't know why. And maybe we never will." Meanwhile, digital analysis of the recovered fragments revealed something unexpected. The metal composition was slightly different from standard wartime alloys, containing trace elements of beryllium and tantalum, materials used only in small-scale laboratory prototypes at the time. That finding suggested ED-825 had been carrying something far more advanced than standard radar, possibly a prototype of post-war technologies that would evolve into stealth and electronic warfare systems decades ahead of their time. When Dr. Hathaway presented her findings at the Imperial War Museum, she closed with a haunting observation. ED-825 was meant to deceive the enemy's radar, to vanish in plain sight. In the end, it did exactly that. The tragedy is that it also vanished from our own history. The official record still lists ED-825 as missing without trace. The RAF's official loss ledger contains no mention of blacklight, no acknowledgement of the mission's true purpose. But among researchers, the case stands as one of the most enigmatic disappearances of the air war, a blend of ambition, secrecy, and silence. Today, when satellite images of the Gorzo Forest are examined, faint metallic readings still register in the soil, the remains of a bomber that was never meant to be found. Some aviation enthusiasts claim to hear, on certain nights when the air is still, the faint echo of engines rolling through the distance, the ghostly hum of Merlins in the dark. But historians prefer another explanation, that history itself sometimes hides its truths too well, and that some missions were designed to leave no witnesses. The men of ED-825, Flight Lieutenant Henry Collins, Navigator Peter Lowe, Flight Engineer Alan Briggs, and their 4 crewmates, have no known grave. Yet their story has become something more than a wartime mystery. It is a reflection of an era when science and war collided, and when the race to outwit the enemy's eyes sometimes blinded its own. As Dr. Hathaway wrote in her final report, perhaps the lesson of ED-825 isn't that it disappeared, but that we kept trying to forget it did. The forest still holds its secrets. The fragments of the bomber rest where they fell, scattered and silent. And though the last official entry in the file reads simply, "Case closed," the mystery of RAF Lancaster ED-825, the lost aircraft of Operation Blacklight, remains open in the minds of all who search for truth in the shadows of history. 6 chapters finished. Waiting for prompt 3.